Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing good today. My name is Melody Benabu, and I'm the part of the webinar today. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar, our monthly webinar. And today will be presented by, of course, NexInfo and Vanguard Software. And today's topic is how to use demand planning software to improve service levels, customer loyalty, and your top and bottom lines. Again, my name is Melody Benabu, and I'm from NexInfo. I'm the regional sales manager here. I have 20 years in technology solution sales experience. And out of that, 15 years experience are delivering financial solutions across industries as well. Today, we have the privilege to have Brian Lewis from Vanguard Software on our webinar. Brian, can you just quickly introduce yourself and share a little bit of your background, experiences, and so forth?
Absolutely. Thanks, Melody. So my name is Brian Lewis. I'm Executive Vice President at Vanguard Software. Very excited to be on the webinar with everybody today. I think we've got a great presentation for you. My background's in supply chain management. I started at Vanguard Software back in 2005. Had a number of different roles within the organization, both working with customers during implementations, now assisting companies during the evaluation and design of their demand planning process. So again, very excited to be with you.
Thanks, Brian. Many of you may already familiar with NexInfo, but quickly for those of you who are not, let me give you a high-level overview of who we are at NexInfo. We are a global business solution company focused on delivering operational excellence on all domain across all industries. Our key differentiator is that we are a blend of business process and software automation. We also always lead our projects with business process definition and key stakeholder alignment. We are very strong on the ERP, CRM, PLM, EPM, data analytics, and business transformation. Our ERP practice includes financials, supply chain, manufacturing, and planning. We're also lucky to have rich industry experience developed over nearly 20 years in business now. We've always also been recognized by many different organizations, as you can see here on the slides, by well-known Gartner and CIO Review. And we have worked with many well-known Fortune 1000 companies for both on-premise and cloud initiatives. Now that I gave you a little bit of a background, let's learn a little bit about Vanguard Software. Founded in 1995, so that's been around 22 years. Bootstrap software company that specializes and focuses in the predictive and prescriptive analytics space via application for supply chain, finance, and sales. They have a large footprint in the supply chain, demand planning, and S&OP application. 3,400 customers in 68 countries, and from a small, medium business size all the way to an enterprise level companies. Today's agenda, we will focus on demand planning introduction, demand planning with Vanguard Software, and a software demonstration that's going to be conducted by Brian. As a reminder, I'd like for you to submit your questions using the question option on the GoToWebinar panel. At any time, if you have a question, just plug it in. And at the end, of course, we will have a Q&A that we will review some of those questions. Did I skip on? Okay. So defining different functions, forecasting, demand planning, and demand management. What that means is many people normally refer to demand planning or demand management very generically. Many times also, people fail to recognize the different functions as separate. So I would like to point out that typically there are three major functions as seen here on the slides: forecasting, demand planning, and demand management. Forecasting, what is it? This is a process of predicting what the demand will be in the future. This can be done many ways, like getting a customer forecast, generating a statistical forecast, creating a sales forecast, etc., etc. Next is demand planning. What this means, this is a process of creating a demand plan that your organization can use to plan for supplies, manage workforce, manage inventory, etc. The demand plan is typically a plan that has more than just a forecast. You have to factor in new products, products in the end of life phase, making sure that the plan aligns with the financial forecast, etc. Right? Ideally, the demand plan and not the forecast should be driving supplies in your organization, right? Lastly, the demand management function. This is the process of managing the demand plan to actual orders and also to inventory policies. This management can include very complex functions like demand or supply allocation, contract compliances, etc. Or it can be simple enough to manage the plan to publish service levels, right? So, where does demand planning fit? Industry challenges. This is a pictorial to show how a lot of issues within the various functions typically point to poor demand planning processes. Things like stock out or excess inventory, things like low service levels, like loss of revenue, a new product launch failure. When you do a root cause analysis, it will point out a poor demand plan. Now, let me uh, take the floor to Brian. And again, if you have any questions, please put it on the GoToWebinar chat panel. Brian, your turn.
All right, thank you, Melody. So we'll pick back up right where Melody left off. As we start going from the demand forecasting, demand planning, demand management, and think about how that process fits into the overall planning process, not just on the demand side, but as Melody already alluded to, into supply, into capacity, into production, into finance, even back into sales. We really start to think about it as an overall planning process and kind of where its role fits in. So when we think about planning in general, we like to talk about sort of four kind of main components. There's some form of analytics, advanced or otherwise, where we're really trying to combine analysis and insight to determine trends, patterns, seasonality, outliers, et cetera, and events to create more accurate forecasts. Again, we're trying to predict the future here, and there's lots of different ways that we can do that, both from a data perspective as well as insight, which is often a lost part of the demand planning process. We know things are going to happen. We know marketing's taking certain action. We believe the sales team is going to try and push harder in a certain product category or a certain channel. And so how do we combine all of that together? But you have to have some core analytics in a high quality demand process. There's also what we think about in terms of collaboration. So we can't just simply run a, say, statistical forecast or some other kind of forecast model. We've already talked about adding in insight, but there's also the human dynamic. If I am a demand planner or a demand forecaster, how do I actually communicate information to the planners? Or if I'm a planner, how do I receive information about activities that the sales team is going to take, or a new marketing campaign that marketing is going to take, or the finance has stretched the targets for us? And so there's individuals that have information that are not necessarily core planners in part of the process. And so there has to be some way to actually go through and capture that. So we think about that as collaboration. We think about that as communication. And also, if we extend beyond just the demand planning process, there's collaboration with the other teams, supply and finance and so on. We also want to think about workflow. How do we actually, in the demand forecasting planning management process, how do we help manage a day in the life of a planner? Everybody's very busy. And so what demands your attention today, as well as where are you at in your planning cycle? Is it a monthly update that you do? And if so, as Melody mentioned, there might be a baseline forecast that gets created, but then we need to add in any kind of new product or product transitions or phase outs. And so how do I know if there are any new products I need to plan for or phase out? And so some concept of workflow becomes very important to help manage the process. And the last one, this is kind of Vanguard specific, this Ohio DB, but as you start thinking about demand planning and demand planning at scale, and I'll put at scale in air quotes here because at scale for a small mid-sized business is very different than kind of at scale for a global Fortune 100. But there needs to be some a kind of a unified nature to bring in all of the data that needs to be involved in the planning process: historical data, pricing data, promotional calendars if you're a promotionally driven company, and so on. The high performance aspect is as the system continues to grow and evolve, or your company continues to grow and evolve, you want to make sure that the underlying technology can be there to support you. Every year, products are being launched and phased out and transitioned. And so how do we manage even more and more data? Year after year, the historical database starts to get larger and larger. You want to make sure that you can do that backwards-looking analysis right alongside your forward-looking analysis. The in-memory piece, this is very common these days, again, to make the systems very high performance. It used to be that you'd go into a system, and if you need to run a complicated report, it could take 30 minutes, an hour, 4 hours, or have to be done overnight. That shouldn't be the case anymore. There's lots of great technologies. And so when you start combining the unified high performance and memory kind of database underlying your planning system, you can now do a lot more in the modern technologies than what you could do in the past. So these are kind of four main areas that I like to talk about: the analytics, the collaboration, the workflow, and also some of the underlying technology to make sure you're set up for the long run. Now, in terms of demand planning, we talk about probabilistic planning as well. And this is, I think, a part that's not often talked about in the demand side. Of course, we are forecasting. We are trying to predict the future here. How many units do we think we're going to ship next month and the month after or the year after, depending on how long in the future? It could be even tomorrow if you're doing very short term. And so how do we take into account the fact that we don't exactly know? We're predicting 20,000, but how off could that be? Could it be higher? Could it be lower? How much higher? How much lower? And what about the month after that? Is it just as unpredictable or not? And when you have uncertainty in the planning process, there are opportunities. And so we like to talk about turning uncertainty into profit. How do we actually hedge our bets against the most uncertain demand variables, certain product lines, certain product categories, certain customers, and so on? How do we capitalize on low risk scenarios? Where can we take advantage of times when we do have more certainty in our planning process? And when we talk about this kind of like risk, we talk about uncertain demand variables, but if we extend that into the supply side and look at optimizing inventory overall, which is a common reason for doing a demand planning process, is saying, well, how much do we think we're going to ship? Therefore, we need to know how much we actually want to hold. Therefore, we know how much we actually want to replenish, whether we're buying our products as a distributor or whether we're manufacturing as a manufacturing company. But ultimately, things like inventory, one of the reasons we hold inventory is as a risk strategy. We want to make sure that we've got enough inventory in stock to satisfy our demand. But again, we don't know that it's 20,000 units we're going to ship next month. It might be, but it might be higher, it might be lower, depending on when orders actually come in. And so again, inventory now becomes a risk management strategy. We can hold more inventory and make sure we can satisfy more orders, but that costs us more. And what happens if the orders don't come in? Then it costs us more because we might have to write it off at some point. If I hold too little because I don't want to, incur that cost, I might be losing sales because if our product is not there, they're going to buy somebody else's. And so ultimately, we like to talk about the probabilistic nature of demand forecasting and planning. The predictive aspect is very important. Now, in terms of real world results, everybody may or may not be following different kinds of research analysts and the reports that's out there, but according to AMR research, best-in-class planners see a 15% reduction in inventory compared to peers, 17% stronger order fulfillment, 35% shorter cash-to-cash cycle times, 90% fewer stockouts than competitors. These are very strong metrics. Who would not want to be able to reduce their inventory 15%? Your finance team and your C-level suite would absolutely love you if you can do that. One example, a current Vanguard customer, Buy Auto Parts, they're an auto parts distributor, has seen about a 20% reduction in inventory while maintaining high customer service levels. They're in a very high customer service focused industry. They cannot have that drop because if products aren't there, they'll go someplace, customers will go someplace else. So 20% reduction in inventory while maintaining customer service levels and increasing their top line revenue, which means they weren't losing sales. They were able to sell more even while dropping their inventory. That's a very difficult thing to do, especially for that type of industry. And yet, with a high quality demand planning process that incorporates the probabilistic nature, the uncertainty, they're able to make sure they're stocking correctly to achieve their business objective. Again, turning uncertainty into profit. And this is, a very great case study. So with that little bit of high-level introduction and overview, I'm going to switch over to Vanguard now so we can actually see a little bit of this in action. And just to reiterate what Melody mentioned earlier, if there are any questions, feel free to use the chat mechanism within the webinar. Melody and I are both paying attention to those questions, and we'll try and answer them. We'll also make sure we've got time at the end for any final Q&A. So I'm going to talk about concepts. I'm going to use Vanguard's software as my talking point, but again, whatever tool set you're using or plan to use in the future, these same concepts are very, very relevant because we're talking more about process and the analytics than Vanguard's tools specifically. Again, it's just having something so we can actually see it. Now, logging into a system, just so you know what you're looking at in Vanguard, and again, every tool set is going to be a little bit different. In Vanguard, the left-hand side is our main navigation, and we're going to spend most of our time right here in the demand planning section. But when I talked before about combining the analytics, which we certainly will see, I also talked about collaboration and workflow, and we can start to see the beginnings of that here. I won't go into great detail, but we can see KPIs that are very important to us. We can see our different workflows, and we'll see that in a little bit more detail in a moment. A variety of different reports to assist with the demand forecasting and planning process. Different stakeholders want to review the demand forecast in different ways. I want to see region by product family, by warehouse, shipping warehouse in units. Sales team wants to see channel by customer and revenues and being able to have reports that show that, or performance reports. How well are we actually doing? So we'll see some of these in action as well. And the right-hand column, at least in Vanguard, is the communication and collaboration. So we are going to go work on our forecast for SKU 100 being shipped out of our warehouse that serves the EMEA region. But how do I get additional information into the process? And so other users that can message and communicate and collaborate, attach files. So we'll see some of this in action as well a little bit later. And let me just move this webinar out of the way so I can close this down. Let me go into the demand planning section. Again, different tools, and I'll kind of keep reiterating that, different tools will organize things differently. At least in Vanguard, we start off with a workflow. If I'm a demand planner, what do I need to actually do? We have a section for all of the different forecasts that we need to work through. And I do use the term typically forecast and plan sort of interchangeably. As Melanie pointed out correctly, they actually can be very, very different in your planning process. So if I flip back and forth between the two, I'm just referring to both the forecast, as you'll see, converting into the plan. But I have a workspace for each of them. So I have a workflow that tells me what I need to do and a workspace to actually do that work. And then the rest of these are different reports that assist with a best practices-based demand planning process. And we'll take a look at some of these. So I'm going to go in my demo system. I have things organized by product family, then by a SKU code, and then by the locations where I ship this SKU out to my customers. Now you can imagine many different types of organization of these forecasts and plans. Do we need to break out this by customer or by channel so I can see who we're actually shipping to so we get customer version of the future? Or do we not need to go down to that level of granularity? There's a lot of work that's been done in demand forecasting and planning, looking at different levels of hierarchies. And just because you have more information, say break down to channel, then customer, then ship to, it doesn't always increase the accuracy at the level that you want to plan for. Let's say shipments of a SKU out of a warehouse. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You might also not need to go all the way down to every single ship to, but certainly breaking out maybe some key customers, your Walmarts and Targets and Amazons, might make sense to work with those and forecast those directly, and then group all of the other kind of mom and pop style customers into a channel or just rolled up. So there's a lot of different variations about defining a demand forecasting and demand planning hierarchy. In my example, though, we're talking about shipments of SKU 100 out of my EMEA warehouse. Now, most demand planning systems and process, of course, you have some historical data. Give me one second, move this webinar control out of the way here. And let me turn off this red line. So what we're looking at here, this is a monthly bucketed system, but again, depending on your demand planning process, you might be doing monthly buckets, weekly, even down to days. Most modern systems can actually support all of those. So you might be forecasting daily for retail sales or for e-com sales, but maybe weekly or monthly for others. We have historical data through October 2018. So this demo data set is a few months old, but we have actuals through October. And starting here in November is the first forecast, the first future period in this example. So in this example, we are forecasting a SKU that we've had for a long time. So there's a nice, long, rich history. And therefore, we can apply some analytics, your classic statistical forecasting, to look for trends and patterns in the blue data and come up with a forecast or a prediction for the future. And that's what we're seeing here. And we can see that there's actually some slight seasonality. There's some other month-to-month variations. Every tool has some form of engine. Vanguard is no different. Every tool has their list of algorithms. Again, Vanguard is no different. That's not the point for today. There's methods that you want to make sure that you have methods for your intermittent or lumpy or long tail kind of demand, which are usually not very predictable. But when we start talking about the uncertainty, you may not be able to predict the onesie, twosie kind of orders or when they're going to come in, but you can get a baseline level and certainly the uncertainty around it. And when you start stocking inventory for those intermittent or lumpy or sporadic kind of items, the uncertainty model is actually almost more important than the predicted model itself, meaning the point forecast. Topics for another webinar for sure. Most tools will also have some way of sifting through all of these algorithms and all of the different models and setting the parameters and finding the patterns in here so that you don't have to do it as a planner. Usually you want to look for systems that also do allow you to have control. At the end of the day, you are, as a demand planner, are responsible for the numbers that you're managing, and therefore you should be able to have control over what kind of patterns and what kind of models it looks for. You also don't want to have to do that, so you want a system that can do it for you. We're not going to go through the details of things like outlier detection or correction or cleansing of your historical data, but these are all, of course, very important parts of the demand forecasting and planning process. Most tools will have some concept of automatic outlier detection and correction and things of that sort. You also want an ability to go in and to be able to edit historical data as needed. So in this case, let's fast forward a little bit. There's a nice long history. A forecast, at least in this case, Vanguard has done its job using the artificial intelligence. It's incorporated every data point that's come in, every data set it has access to, and this is the forecast. And we're seeing that right here. This is what we're calling our starting value. This is, as Melody mentioned, this is our demand forecast. What kind of trends and patterns can we detect? Also, I haven't mentioned it yet, but that pink band around the line, this is where we start to get into the uncertainty model. The system is predicting that for April 2019, the point value is 7,136 units expected to ship in that month. But we don't exactly know. No matter how good a system is, there's always uncertainty. So there's different ways of modeling uncertainty. Again, that could be a topic for an entire webinar on its own. The way that at least Vanguard does it is it runs what's called a Monte Carlo simulation. Effectively, for every month into the future, there are thousands of data points kind of behind the scenes that are helping guide that uncertainty model. And then what we're showing in that pink band are what are called percentiles. Again, we're thinking kind of from a probability perspective. The lower side of the pink band says that there's only a 5% chance that our demand would come in lower than that low side of the pink band. And the high side is what's called a 95th percentile, kind of the opposite end, where we're saying there's only a 5% chance that demand would come in higher than the pink band. And technically, we could say in any given month, how likely is the demand to be within a certain range, within 100 units of the predicted point value, and so on. And so that probabilistic nature can become very important. Again, we always say nobody forecasts or demand plans just for the sake of demand planning. That plan is going elsewhere into the business. And I'll show a little bit of preview in a bit in this inventory section about how this uncertainty is flowing directly into how your supply teams, or you if you're a planner doing both sides, would be setting things like your safety stock. Also, you want to make sure that whatever uncertainty model you're applying, either in a formal tool like Vanguard or even in your side spreadsheets, that you want to make sure that that uncertainty can change over time. You want to make sure that your future data points can incorporate more uncertainty than your more recent months, meaning, or your close-in months. Meaning it's a little bit easier to perhaps predict next month than it is, a year from now. Who knows what's going to happen a year from now? And so you want to make sure your probability models, your uncertainty models can adapt to that. Because if you have very long lead times, like you see in certain industries, you're basically placing your bets, so to speak, your orders to hold inventory for further in the future where you have more uncertainty. Okay, so what else happens? So this is let's call this our forecast. And actually, as a slight digression, of course, different product lines, you'll need to forecast differently. If you have a brand new product that hasn't launched yet, or it only has a few, say, months of shipments, there is no long history to really work from. So how are you possibly going to forecast that? Most solutions, Vanguard included, have ways of doing that. You can do what's called, for example, a comparable forecast. This new product, we believe, is comparable or similar to another product, a whole set of products. It'll behave like every black t-shirt that we've seen. It might behave like a certain product in a certain customer. We often think in the demand planning process about new products and how do we model NPIs, but also we have the same issue with new customers. A new customer is going to start to carry our product. How do we forecast this product at this customer? Well, we think it's going to behave and sell comparably to how that product behaves and sells at another customer. And just so you can see kind of the example here, if I go down into an item, you can see it's very little history here. Here we have a flat forecast. Visually, we'd say that's reasonable. I know it's reasonable because the engine is coming up with that pattern. You also can see here where the uncertainty model, the one that you want to see, actually gets wider and wider pretty quickly because there's very little data to go on, so it's uncertain where this might go. Could it keep increasing? Could it go back down? But what we want to be able to do is say, I don't have a lot of information. However, I do believe that this is going to behave a lot like this other product. And now we see a very different forecast. And what's going on, at least in the systems that do this, is they've mined through whatever filters you've set, pulled in all of that information, and said, this is the pattern that we see with this other comparable group. Therefore, I'm going to set the magnitude correctly. I'm going to time align everything. And now we see that, in fact, you're not flat. You're on the increasing trajectory of a seasonal pattern. And so, again, we won't go through all of the analytics of how to do this, but most modern systems will have ways of doing this for you, using other information as guides for your new products or, say, new customers or anything new really in your system. So back here, and I'm going to put this red line on just so we can play around and see some deviations. Let's ignore the historical red line. Think of it effectively as what Vanguard would have forecasted back at that time in the system. So let's get into the next part, the adjustments and what we call adjustments and overrides. This is where we're starting to bring in different kind of insights. Already what we can see in this table are two other versions of demand plans for this same SKU warehouse combination. We're saying, well, what is the sales team saying? So I've got a row for our sales contributors. What about finance? What did they set in terms of their budget? Or think of it as like the revenue target. How does that compare here? So we're starting to build up alternative versions of our demand forecast or demand plan to be part of, say, a consensus process. And any company who's doing that, they have different ways of kind of thinking about consensus and driving to consensus. But we start to bring in other teams in this example. Also, I won't go through all of the details, but finance is probably not doing their own version of a SKU, shipments of each SKU out of each warehouse. And in fact, in this example, we're saying finance set a budget, a revenue target at the region level. So they're saying for all of EMEA, we have a certain revenue target that we want to be at. Now, in most modern systems, they support a top-down forecast allocation, and that's what Vanguard has done here. Is it's taken the revenue targets for EMEA, it broke it down to all product families in EMEA, ultimately down into all SKUs, and eventually down to all warehouses. The sales team, kind of a similar concept. The sales team is usually not thinking SKUs and warehouses and volume shipment. They might be, but probably not. They're usually thinking revenues and product families, or maybe a channel, or even key customer accounts. How many dollars can I sell into Target this year? And maybe some key product lines. So we've done another form of a top-down, in this case, region family, and then ultimately breaking down into SKU. However it's done, and however many different variations of plans your company might have, you now have a forecast, and we now have at least two versions of plans in my example. What else might be useful in this context? Well, maybe I would like to see what some people call their open orders or firm orders or their order book. We're predicting to ship 5,988 units in November. Again, remember that November 2018 is a future period in this demo data set. But how many orders do we actually have for units to actually ship out in November so far? Because as customers might be placing orders, I might want to see that in line. If we're in the middle of the month, I might want to see my month-to-date shipments. Where are we tracking? How well are we doing against what we predicted? And is that cause for alarm or not? And so there's a lot of different types of data sets and comparisons that we might want in here. What about the insight? Suppose that I just got an alert through whatever form of communication collaboration hub that you have. Vanguard has one built in that says, we believe that SKU 100 is going to be a more popular product. So I might have gotten a note, here, we believe that we will win the hardware tender in EMEA, bump up SKU 100 in EMEA by 10% in Q2. Perfect. I would have just gotten alerted that that's going on. And these are things that are often either in email or phone. Again, some of the more modern systems will have these kinds of collaboration and communication hubs built in so that all of that information stays. You can see, at least in Vanguard, we also use hashtagging so that people can follow what's going on with hardware or EMEA, things that are relevant to them, so that they can incorporate it and pay attention. So let's say, okay, we said in Q2 we need to bump this up 10%. Perfect. So I'm going to go in. I need to add an adjustment, because this is a future change. This is not something that we can predict off the historical data now. So we're going to say, all right, I'm going to say there's going to be some sales growth that we are expecting. So some process of putting in a new adjustment, kind of like inserting a new row in a spreadsheet. And we said starting in Q2, which is in April. So we need to bump it up 10%. So I need to put in a plus 10%. We see a little blip up in the forecast here. Here, the red line is what the forecast originally was, and it's up 10%. Now, the message was starting in Q2, not just in Q2. So I'm going to say, we'll apply a 10% lift. So now we've done a great thing here. We've combined the analytics to get the patterns that we want. We're combining some insight. Now, it's not just going to magically bump up 10% in 1 month. I mean, there's reasons why. Suppose that Target was going to roll it out to 10% more stores. Well, that might actually bump up my Target forecast by 10%. But also we can grow things, like change the trend by 10% per year, or I'll say per quarter to be really dramatic, and bump that all the way up. Okay, what else do we know? So now I've accounted for that. If I was following good best practice, I would go in, I would actually document this. I would reply back to this message and say, okay, I've taken care of it. So kind of having good documentation as well is very important in the process, because we always say, we know why we're doing this today if I'm the planner, but if you ask me 3 months from now or 6 months from now when we're doing our performance analysis, there's no way I'm going to remember why exactly this was the case. So again, that's where your collaboration and communication hubs come in. What else do we know? Just to show one other thing, I'll just say, well, we have some kind of an event. you'd probably be much more descriptive of what this is. And it's also going to increase or decrease our demand in some future period. I'll say 500 units this time, maybe because of a promotion. Now, most systems also have ways of automatically looking for things like events and promotions and automatically incorporating them into your forecast or plan. So depending on your analytics, I've got one example here where more than we can cover today, but effectively there's the equivalent of base demand, and then there's an entire promotional calendar, promotions being run every single month that are going to be added into our base normal demand. So there's some highly modeled promotions and correlations that can be done in your demand planning process, again, if that's part of your industry, and a variety of ways of doing that. But in this example, it's just yet another variation of insight or adjustments to your base forecast. And so a lot of best practices around the demand planning process will talk a lot about how to effectively decompose your final demand plan into a variety of types of signals, base patterns, base forecast, insights, modeled insights, and so on. Now, at the end of the day, however we do it, we now have a pretty high quality, what we call subtotal. I can compare it to all my other plans, compare it to my order book. If I'm a demand planner, though, I always want an override line, some way to control the final number. I don't want to have to use this number if I don't want to. Maybe I want to make it 9,000, and so I can have that final say, some ability to control the final number. You need to have that where you in your systems. At the same time, if we start talking about process efficiency as a planner, I don't want to have to do any of these things, ideally, just let the system do its job. And so anything that I do to intervene in any kind of manual way, changing a forecast method, cleaning my history, adding in that 10% growth, even though I was messaged that I should do it, overriding my forecast, there's different labels for it, but you always want to have some form of forecast value add analysis in your process for process improvement. We call it a forecaster performance analysis in Vanguard. And it's basically designed to identify which types of manual interventions are actually adding value to your process, i.e. increasing your accuracy, versus degrading it. Every time Brian overrides the forecast, I'm only making it worse. So basically, feedback to me from a process improvement perspective, hey, Brian, don't keep doing that. You're wasting time and you're only making things worse. So feedback the good stuff and stop doing the bad stuff. So make sure that that's part of your process as well. Now, just to drive this home, at the end of the day, I now have a forecast. People call this the point forecast. In every tool that you use, and in Vanguard, you also want the uncertainty around it, because this is not your demand forecast or plan. This is just the point forecast for one individual month or a sequence of months. We need the entire model with it, because the next team that uses this has to know, when you say 7,432 in June, how likely is that number? Because your supply planning team is trying to make some decisions about how much to buy, and your production planning teams how much to make, to actually make sure that we can ship that out. But we don't know for sure. And so that's where we start getting into the next step of the process. So this is not the end of your demand forecast or your demand plan. If it is, definitely would recommend you kind of rethink the way that kind of what these numbers mean, and more importantly, who else is using them and how they would interpret that. In our example, if I expand this bottom section, we're going to flow that demand plan directly into the inventory. So we're actually saying, okay, how much do we have on hand right now? So these are things that your ERP system has and can be imported into your planning system. How much is on order right now? I'm going to cheat a little bit and put in a new order. Basically, what I'm going to do is this would be something that would be imported from an ERP. So we're saying right now, this warehouse has 1,569 units that can ship out the door right now. This demo system is assuming that today is November 27th. So it's assuming that there are 1,000 units that are scheduled to arrive tomorrow on the 28th. That'll be added into my on-hand inventory. All right, so then what are we going to do from a supply perspective? Effectively, what we want to do on your supply planning teams are going to get to ultimately some form of this schedule. It's called an optimized schedule in Vanguard, but this is the replenishment plan. We need to place a replenishment order for 10,610 units today, It'll arrive on December 11th. After that, the next time we think we'll need to replenish is in January, on January 22nd, a different quantity, and arrives some lead time later. And eventually, this is showing the planned replenishment. Now, replenishment could be coming from a spoke warehouse coming from a central DC, or from a warehouse from a production facility, or even from a supplier. It's just a request for more product and when that request needs to be executed in order to get it in time. But how do we know? So we start talking about strategies, and again, a topic for a different webinar. But in this case, we're saying we want to make sure that we hold inventory to achieve a 99% fill rate. Well, the only way a 99% fill rate is effectively a probability game. How do we make sure that we have a 99% fill rate, which means we have a kind of 1% kind of missed opportunity there? Well, we have to account for the fact that we don't know where we are in terms of actual demand. We might be really high, so we need to account for that. Also, in terms of probability, your replenishment lead time. In my example, we're saying it's a 14-day lead time, but in reality, we don't exactly know. If your replenishment ever shows up on day 15, even 1 day late, then you have lead time uncertainty as well. And so things like setting your safety stock need to simultaneously account for both your demand uncertainty as well as your lead time uncertainty. And of course, lead time uncertainty can be, simple or it can be very complicated. If I place an order today, I have a QA hold once I receive it, and that takes a different amount of time. There's transit time from, let's say, from a manufacturer, that's uncertain. The actual manufacturing time, normally it takes them 6 weeks to produce it, but sometimes the lines go down, so therefore it could be a little bit longer. So you might actually have multiple components to your lead time. Anyway, we're not going to go through much more on the supply side. That's not really the point of today's webinar. But the main thing I wanted to make sure is that link is there between, at least in my example, my demand forecast was shipments of SKUs out of a warehouse to my customers. And then we know that that forecast flows into some other part of the planning process, inventory, production, or whatever else. Take the same context and say, instead of shipments of SKU 100 out of the EMEA warehouse, this is sales of SKU 100 out of my retail location number 123. So you might be SKU store combinations. That's okay. That's still the same concept. How much inventory do I have in the store? How much is coming from my supplier or from a warehouse? And how much do I need more? Even if we fast forward into very different kind of planning, production planning, this is now a forecast for consumption driven off of MRP. How much inventory do you have? What kind of uncertainties? And what's your buy plan for procurement out to raw material vendors? So just wanted to show a little bit of extension beyond just today's topic in terms of the plans and how they move forward. Make sure that we linked the uncertainty concept that we talked about earlier into that planning process, and that this is not your forecast. It's this plus a whole lot more, at least it should be. And also start talking about things like customer service levels, top line revenue, the ability to make sure we hit a fill rate, which means I'm not losing sales, and we're willing to hold inventory and just the right amount of inventory to achieve some objective. And there can be a variety of different objectives that you might have in your business. And with that, I'm going to end the demo portion. I see that there's a comment that just came in. And the question is, what extended features are available on Vanguard to handle bill of materials or BOMs? Excellent question, because it's, of course, an important part of the demand planning process. Here, I've focused my commentary around SKU 100 being effectively a finished good SKU. But when we say we need to ship SKU 100, this SKU might also be a kit. It's actually bundled together multiple products. That's one form of a bill of materials. Another one is we actually have a true kind of manufacturing bill of materials. So I could go through and say, I need to turn this on. And effectively what we're doing now is going through and saying, okay, for every one of these SKUs, what are the different either piece components of my kit or physical bill of materials? I need packaging, I need plastic cellophane wrapping around it, I need a label, I need a container, I need the product going into it. And we can actually show some other examples if anybody's curious in follow-on demos or separate meetings around a multi-level bill of materials, but effectively you're linking this thing to a subset of things that go into it. There can be an explicit quantity or a take rate. We can offset by lead times, and the bill of materials can actually be time-based because you might be phasing out component parts. And then each one of these components might have its own bill of materials, so you get a multi-level BOM. All right, question number 2. Are there time period restrictions for forecasting using the software? So I can answer that specifically with Vanguard. The answer is no. I mentioned the time bucket in this example being monthly, but it certainly could be weekly or daily, or we could actually go even higher, quarterly or annual for longer range planning. And in Vanguard, you can mix and match. And then also the time horizon. We're only showing the next 12 periods here, but that's just a display setting on this screen. If I go into some of the reports, for example, I might want to look calendar year 2018 in months, but I can roll up or down in time. I can project that forward. I can be looking at 12 months, and I can say, well, here's my hardware forecast versus my software forecast. I need to see them together, and so there's different visualizations. But also I can extend forward and say, instead of 12 months, I want to look the next 36 months and project out. The type of analytics that you use as you project further into the future, time series analysis is great, but if you try and predict 5 years with a time series on monthly data or weekly or daily, you're going to have some degradation the further in the future you go, so you might want to switch over to a different kind of forecasting model. But at least in our software, no, there are no restrictions on time. All right, question number 3. We have a big disconnect between the monthly family S&OP forecast and the demand management forecast that is sent to the plants. What's the best way to make them meet? Great question, age-old question, certainly. Typically in a demand planning process, what we see, at least the way we talk about it at Vanguard, and I think NexInfo follows this as well, is we're always trying to look at what level do you want it, what level in your kind of planning hierarchy, I'll call it that way, at what level do you want your forecast to be the most accurate? And the reason I say it that way is in some cases, like in my example, if what we want to make sure is that we can hit a very high service level for our customers, because we're in a high customer service oriented industry, then I need to make sure that I can achieve this shipment forecast. In which case, we want this level to be the most accurate, each individual level, which means when I roll up to the total SKU 100 level for production, typically when you aggregate up a level, you do get higher and higher accuracy because some of the individual noise starts to cancel out. So we could have said for production purposes or pure replenishment, we're going to go all the way up to the SKU 100 level. That's going to increase my demand signal at SKU 100, but then I need to break it back down into my individual, say, shipping locations in this example. Or you see the same thing with channel forecast. I can forecast at the channel, but then I do want to break it down into customers and then customers into products. So typically, as you go up the hierarchy and aggregate your data first and then forecast on the aggregated data, you tend to see a higher quality or more stable demand signal and some reduction in your uncertainty. But if you do need the lower levels for planning purposes, it often makes sense to go down to that level. I don't know the exact data, so it's a little bit difficult to say exactly the right way of doing it. But one of the things when we start saying whatever level we want to get the most accurate, how do we start to bring in these different kind of variations of the plans and then drive towards consensus? I feel like that was a little bit of a non-answer answer. Happy to take that offline as well and learn a little bit more about your circumstance, Vanguard and NexInfo, and maybe make some recommendations there. Also, just in terms of top downs, we see this a lot where a company will say, we know we have some lowest level granularity. We want a forecast and be able to adjust our forecast at the channel or customer level, sort of a channel view. But then we also have from a product perspective, we believe that our hardware family is growing. So I want to bump up hardware 10%. And I want to bump up my target revenue forecast by 5%. Well, by the time you start trying to reconcile both of those plans, you may not actually have some matches. And so in Vanguard, there's a way to force them to reconcile. In other cases, you effectively have 2 different versions of your demand plan, and then you're in a consensus process. Hopefully that was helpful. Question number 4, what lag should you use when you measure your forecast error if you are also implementing lean? Also a good question in terms of how you measure forecast error and the lag. We have a kind of a specific view around kind of the forecast accuracy and the lag. A lot of times what companies will do is say, once we've at a certain point in our planning process, we lock or fix the demand forecast, and it cannot change because the other teams need to react to that and start planning around it. Our view of it actually is if I have a 3-month lead time, of course, a 3-month, not so much lag, but I want to be thinking about what's happening over the course of these 3 months. So even though a lot of planning processes will actually lock the individual periods, because there's uncertainty, when November actuals hit, the actuals might be higher or lower, which means that any overage or underage kind of flows into December. Well, December might be higher or lower. So even though you're placing an order now for a lead time that might show up in the future, we often like to and recommend looking at not a 3-month lag because you have a 3-month lead time, but the aggregate over the course of a 3-month period. How well can you predict the 3-month aggregate? Because again, overages or underages kind of flow through into follow-on periods. So we tend to think about that as opposed to a lag. Nothing wrong with looking at a lag as well to say how well can you predict this number, but these things are going to change if these numbers are higher or lower. All right, question number 5, and I know I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I know we have 8 minutes left here. Question number 5, let me just read the question here for a moment. I think there's a little bit of a typo here. It says, do your location optimization based on the demand for an item to a region zip, for example, decide what SKUs should be stocked in which location in the network? Okay, great question. Basically, when we actually are looking at demand for an item, and in this case, I'm saying it's my EMEA warehouse, when we're shipping, at least I think this is my interpretation, when I actually ship out these 5,988 units, am I looking at where they're being shipped to, say, within the EMEA region, all the way even down to the equivalent of a zip code and kind of getting further and more granular? And should those orders really be shipped out of this warehouse versus a different warehouse? So different systems will do it differently. You might think of that as sort of a network optimization, so to speak. I mean, given that you have, say, fixed shipping locations, how do you map customers and ship tos or orders coming in to those locations? That's sort of one form of sort of network optimization, kind of your customer mapping. The other kind of variation of that is you have these 4 warehouses. Should you open a 5th? And if so, where? Or should you shut down one of these? That's kind of another variation of sort of a network optimization or supply chain optimization. Also, there's a variation of, given that we have these fixed warehouses and we have even maybe forecasts that are broken further down by region or by ship to, which we could have done in this demo. What happens if I have excess inventory in one location that I could use to satisfy demand at another location because it's running a little bit low? And so that's another form of sort of inventory or network inventory optimization. So I guess the question is, how do you decide which SKUs should be stocked in which location within the network? That's typically beyond just a demand planning or simply how do we optimize the replenishment plan. We actually are looking now into more of the financial model behind the supply chain design. What's it actually costing us to service our customers and shipping SKU 100 out of these locations versus if we were to ship it out of a different location? And Vanguard certainly has ways of building out those financial models and periodically running sort of the re-optimization of which SKUs should be done in which warehouses. There's other solutions out there that do that as well, kind of more periodically or one-off analysis versus ones that are embedded within the overall process. So yes, you definitely can break it down further and do some of that. We typically would recommend it's a financial analysis because there's like a one-time cost to, say, transition all that inventory from one location to a new one. And then there's what's your ongoing cost to satisfy or service your customers. All right, I don't see any immediate questions. There might be a few more coming. But at least in terms of my presentation, that would conclude unless there's any final questions. So Melody, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks again, everyone, for attending our webinar today. I hope it was very informative for y'all. And if you need to get in touch with NexInfo or Brian, We do have on our website a Let's Talk email address. So you can use the email address let's talk at nexinfo.com, or you can call, or you can send us an email. Would love to hear from you. And again, thank you so much, Brian. Great job. Thank you so much, everybody. And we will conclude our webinar now. And everybody have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Happy planning.